Harvey Mansfield, William R. Kennan Professor of Government, Harvard University.
Seth Benardete was a philosopher and a family man. He was a philosopher who believed that philosophy had to be history of philosophy in our time. He agreed with Leo Strauss that modern philosophy was diminished philosophy, and that modern philosophy had covered up philosophy, and therefore philosophy had to recover itself in the history of philosophy. To study the history of philosophy, a philosopher needs scholarship. And scholarship has to be classical scholarship, and classical scholarship is of the Greeks. So Benardete was a scholar of the Greek philosophers and the Greek poets. Both of them, not one or the other, as most do. He was a patron of the old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. But he was also a skeptic about that quarrel. He was not sure that the quarrel went very deep. That he was a philosopher, he always knew. That he was a family man, he learned as he lived his life. As Jane Johnson came into his life, somehow I remember her maiden name. And he fell in love with her, not expecting to, I'm sure. And as his children, Emma and Ethan, were born, there was not much in his life in the middle between philosophy and family. He followed politics very closely. He always had something interesting to say about the politics of the day, but he stayed out of it. He was not a public intellectual. He read the TLS, but he never wrote for it. And this, I think, was because he was not an angry man. He never grinned, sniggered, and cracked his knuckles like Hugh Lloyd Jones. There was no scholarly malice in him. He loved gossip, but he never generated it. Once when we were at Eliot House at Harvard, and Seth was a junior fellow and I was a graduate student, I invited him to my room to drink some wine for some sort of celebration. It was a bottle of Rhine wine. And he took one taste, and he said, "It's a little too sweet for me." I went on drinking. And at the end of the bottle, he said, "You are sweeter than I am." Now, is that true? Because I think he became sweeter, a sweeter man than I am. By the way, he wouldn't drink whiskey. He said, "The mind is muddled enough on its own." That's the only time I've ever heard that reason for not drinking whiskey. But he was not equipped with the male desire to hit a ball. Once during this period, we played squash. This was my idea, my importunacy. And he consented. "You'll win," he said. Meaning that this was the first time he had played. And it's true, he was not very good, except in one regard. He was very good at swooping to the front of the court to catch a short shot, which he did like this, holding the racket something like a spoon. He played squash as if he were playing badminton, which I think he did play. I would sometimes provoke him, like James Boswell to Dr. Johnson. And so once I said to him, "You're really quite handsome, you know." And he smiled and said, "Yes," in a ghastly sort of way. He was fearless, almost too fearless to be courageous. Once he was mugged in pre-Giuliani New York. This was recounted to me by his family, that they all went to some event, and Seth had to get the car out of a garage, and the rest were waiting for him. It was a very long wait, and finally Ethan guessed that perhaps he had been mugged, and that was the case. And so when I heard this, I asked him, "Weren't you afraid?" And he said, "Either the guy was going to pull the trigger or he wasn't." So I think he had a happy life. He got what he wanted and more. And these were things supremely worth having. It's too bad that it had to come to an end. Or do all good things come to an end? Or isn't that one of his questions?
Ronna Berger, professor and chair of philosophy, Tulane University.
I want to say I'm very honored, really, to be here today, and I hope I know I'm speaking for many of you here who've had some of the experiences I've had, and also for many from whom I've gotten such wonderful messages in the last few weeks who are here with us and their thoughts today. Seth Benardete was, to put it most simply, my teacher, but what that meant was so determinative that he was the dividing point for me. There was life before knowing Benardete and life after. In the sudden silence of the last few months, the Platonic passage I keep recalling, one he often mused over, describes thinking as an internal conversation within one's own soul. As Benardete pointed out, that means one must be able to ask oneself a question, presumably because one does not know, provide an answer to it, ask another question in response. He was himself a master of the process. As for myself, his voice became so internalized that thinking is almost always an imagined conversation with him. And yet, as I am now so painfully aware, there is no internal substitute for conversation with Benardete, no way to play both parts. As I've seen already in the last few months, thinking about any text or idea, event, or character just won't be the same when it cannot be shared with him. Perhaps you noticed the name I've used is Benardete. I deliberated about this and made the decision for one thing, because that's how we spoke about him among friends, as many of you in the room today this afternoon know. And we spoke of him or his ideas very often, since, as again I see so clearly now, not only was he central in my life, but a part of almost all the other relationships that were important to me, are important to me, friends, students, my husband, Robert. As I say that, a memory comes back to me of the conversation I had with him when I told him Robert and I were about to get married. He spontaneously spun off something like an intellectual rap song about what would happen when you mixed Hegelian and Platonic dialectics and tried to make a life of it. I speak of Benardete today for another reason. I refer to him that way for another reason. Because I am naturally looking back to the beginnings, and it took so long for him to become Seth to me. He addressed me as Miss Berger for many years. At least 10, I know, judging from the letters I've been reading recently, rereading. It was amazing to me that there could be so close a connection within such a formal framework. My interaction with him, I thought, brought out what was most important and best to me, yet I never talked in any ordinary way with him about myself. Only much later did I realize that this distancing from the self, from the concern with individuality, was the way Benardete understood what Socrates in the Phaedo calls the practice of death and dying, which the philosopher is engaged in throughout his life. I came to New York in the fall of 1969 to study with Benardete, after having asked an undergraduate classics professor who's the best person with whom I can go on studying Plato, as he had introduced me to it. I wasn't exactly encouraged when I first introduced myself to Benardete, and he shrugged off this recommendation. I had no idea when I began attending his seminars at the New School that he had only been teaching there for 4 years. It seemed as if he must have been doing it his whole life. Before the semester began that fall, I learned that he was scheduled to present a public lecture at the City University Graduate Center on Book 3 of De Anima, one of the most influential but obscure passages, I'm sure, in the history of philosophy. I went up to CUNY and walked into the lecture room, a little intimidated, and began listening to a talk that seemed to be in a foreign language. For some reason, I didn't experience it as frustrating, though. I was utterly intrigued, somehow certain that the activity of thinking I was hearing about was being enacted in a most vivid way right before my eyes. The semester soon began with a course on Plato's Timaeus. I have no idea what exactly I could have learned from those lectures. Benardete himself started anew when he returned to it years later. But I was enthralled, watching him wrestle with Plato's likely story about the genesis and structure of the cosmos. The seminar met once a week, and for me, the 6 days in between more or less disappeared, swallowed up, trying to get ready for the next session. As I discovered over the years, Benardete kept up with all the fascinating developments in contemporary cosmology, not just reading the popular accounts in the newspapers, but the writings of the physicists. If, as I believe is the case, he had a genuine understanding of the core of the problems they address, it was through Plato's guidance. This was true, or more so, of his interest in politics, of the way he probed all the strange and disturbing political phenomena of our century. When he was studying a Platonic dialogue, he was entirely absorbed in it. It became a world unto itself. But it was never just a text to be interpreted. It was the way into understanding the world, not through the artificial imposition of any kind of fixed system, but in an altogether natural way, which brought out how real things can be so perplexing and intelligible at once. I was vividly reminded of this in the last 2 weeks when Robert called my attention to 2 articles in the paper. One was the report of a recent colloquium about the problem of putting together quantum mechanics and gravity, held to mark the birthday of Stephen Hawking, who was arguing for the importance of incorporating the perspective of the observer in trying to solve these problems. We both wanted to reach for the phone immediately and get Benadete's take. He surely would have seen the report on this latest version of what he called the Platonic art of fantastics, which he applied in so many original ways. Then there was the piece on the Pashtun mothers who, as the journalist put it, sing the law to their children every day. Benardete would have loved to hear this confirmation of his reading of Plato's Laws, which is a profound, I think, exploration of a pun on nomos, law and song. The Laws was the last of the most notoriously challenging Platonic dialogues, to which Benardete seemed to be drawn from early on. In the years I attended his courses at the New School, we studied the Parmenides, Philebus, Theaetetus, Sophist, Statesman, only the hardest of Plato's works. Later, he would give me at the end of the semester a copy of the notes he had written up in preparation, which seemed to grow longer and longer over time. The last time through the Parmenides, I just checked yesterday in my office, was over 300 pages. In a small, rather controlled script, which for some reason I had no trouble deciphering, he worked his way through the dialogue, continuously putting his hypotheses to the test, caught up in the puzzles, but trying to put it together as a whole. While his ideas may have been inspired, his productivity was really the result of discipline. After completing each course, I think he sat down almost immediately and began writing up what he had come to see. This was the source, I believe, of almost all his articles and his books. I realize only now that it was 20 years or so before the fruits of his labors began appearing publicly in the remarkable stream of books on Plato published by Chicago, which continued until this year. To be an apprentice philosopher is undoubtedly a contradiction in terms. One learns by imitating, but how does one grow beyond that?